You wake up to the sound of hooves, not from the fields, but from something older. The air is thick, not just with fog, but with fear. It clings to the heather, presses against the hills, and settles into every heartbeat. Outside your door, the wind carries a low, mournful baying. Someone whispers, "The hunt is coming." You pull your cloak tighter, praying the mist will hide you, praying it will hide you. But the rustle in the reeds betrays your presence. It's centuries ago. The year doesn't matter. The land itself has remembered. People say the riders are spirits, ghosts of warriors, hunters, or the damned. They hear the hounds before the horns. They light fires, cross themselves, and lock their doors, anything to keep safe, while the hunt sweeps through every valley and moor. But behind the superstition lies something darker. How fear reshaped communities, how law and custom twisted under the weight of dread, how legends became warnings, and warnings became reality. This isn't just folklore. This is what it felt like to live under the eyes of something merciless, ancient, and unstoppable, where a single step beyond the path could be your last. Welcome to Forgotten Terrors of Ancient England, Hounds, Huntsmen, and Harbingers. And tonight, you're not just hearing the story, you're in the hunt. The wind moves first soft as a sigh across the high ridges, where the heather lies dark and brittle against the stones. It carries no scent of rain or blossom, only the hollow breath of something ancient. Those who walk here after sunset say the air thickens, as though the earth itself is drawing breath, listening for footsteps it once knew. The moors are never silent, not truly. Even in the stillness, there is a murmur beneath the wind, a low, shivering hum that sounds like the land remembering its dead. No one knows when the whispers began. Shepherds speak of hearing them at dusk, when the sky bruises to violet and the sheep grow restless. Their dogs lift their heads, eyes wide, as if catching a sound too deep for men to hear. It rolls across the open heath like smoke, a rhythm of words too slow to understand, too close to be dismissed as wind. And always, it begins where no road leads, where the ground softens into peat and the old stones tilt toward the west. Long before the first monasteries rose on these hills, the people who lived here built cairns for their dead. They believed the soul might lose its way in the fog, so they stacked stones to guide it home. Each cairn marked a story: a hunter lost to the mire, a mother taken by fever, a child struck silent by the winter chill. In time, the mounds grew, covered by moss and lichen, until they looked like part of the moor itself. But when the wind cut through the valleys just right, it was said the dead beneath them could speak again. The Romans heard it too. Their road through the marshes ran straight as judgment, yet their diaries whisper of nights when the legionaries broke rank and fled. They wrote of torchlight swallowed by mist, of unseen dogs pacing the edges of their camp, of distant horns carried on the wind. When morning came, the footprints were gone, but the fear remained. Even their gods, so proud and carved in marble, felt small here. The moors belonged to older spirits, wild, nameless, and cold. As the centuries turned, the whispers changed their shape. The priests who came after called it temptation, the devil's breath curling through the gorse, luring travelers from the path. Yet even they built their chapels far from the highest ridges. In the long evenings of winter, when the bells froze solid and no fire could hold its flame, they would pause mid-prayer, certain they'd heard a voice outside the door. Some swore it was a man crying for mercy. Others said it was only the moor itself, remembering what mercy once sounded like. On calm nights, when the fog sinks low and the stars blur to silver, old folk still warn against listening too closely. They say the land keeps count of every name spoken in its darkness, that once it knows yours, it will whisper it back long after you're gone. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep, a traveler will hear it, his own name drawn out across the heather, slow as breath, heavy as soil. And when that happens, no one answers. Not here, not where the moors still whisper of the first hunt, and of the hounds that have never stopped running. It begins so softly that most mistake it for the ordinary breath of the moor, the restless murmur of grass bending, the long exhale of a distant storm. But those who know the land can tell the difference. There's a tone beneath the wind, a resonance that hums against the ribs, faint and steady like a drum wrapped in wool. Some call it the wind's second voice. Others, who've walked home after dark, say it's something older trying to speak through the air itself. The first accounts come from shepherds, centuries apart, yet strangely alike. Each tells of a night when the air went heavy and the dogs refused to move. The flocks huddled together as if waiting for rain, but the sky remained dry, so dry it cracked the lips. Then came the sound, not quite a horn, not quite a growl, a deep vibration that trembled through the stones. They say it moved across the hills in waves, slow and deliberate, pausing as though listening for an answer. Travelers learned to measure distance by the pauses between those tones. A single call meant the sound was far off, wandering through another valley. 2 meant it had drawn near. 3, and the horses began to shake. By the 4th, the air would change, the wind falling suddenly still, the birds dropping silent as if some great unseen thing had entered the world. It is in that silence, people say, that the hounds begin to gather. In the parish records of Devon and Somerset, a few priests tried to give the sound a name. They wrote of tempest spirits, sky riders, unholy breath. One scholar insisted it was thunder trapped beneath the earth, echoing through the limestone caves. But even he confessed that the noise carried intent, that it rose and fell as if answering something unseen. A few pages later, his handwriting changes. The ink darkens, letters tremble, and a single line ends his study. I heard it from the churchyard this evening. It knew my name. When the storms sweep in from the channel, moors come alive again. The sound folds itself into the gale, low and mournful, almost human. Farmers lock their doors, draw their curtains, and watch the candle flames bend toward the east. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the unseen chase begins, hoofbeats muffled by mist, hounds crying through the wind's throat. The villagers say those who die on such nights are not carried to heaven or hell, but run forever in that endless hunt, their souls bound to the thunder they once mistook for sky. And yet, not all who hear the sound are struck by fear. Some walk toward it. In the oldest tales, those who carried guilt or grief too heavy for prayer followed the voice into the darkness. None returned, but the following spring, their names were heard among the murmurs drifting beneath the wind, steady and sorrowful, as if the moor itself had taken pity and allowed them to join the chorus that never ends. So when the wind begins to tremble across the high ground, the wise do not listen too long. They lower their heads, keep their pace, and pray not to hear their own name carried within the sound beneath the wind. Before the churches rose, before the Latin tongue claimed the prayers of England, there was a king whose faith clung to the old gods like moss to stone. His name was whispered, not written, for the monks who survived his age refused to ink it. They called him simply the last heathen lord, the one who would not kneel. When the priests came bearing crosses and clean water, he met them with fire. He swore that no foreign god would rule his soil, no white-robed cleric would steal the thunder from his hills. They say he made his oath upon a night of storms. The sky burned green, and the clouds rolled low, thick as iron. His warriors gathered around a bonfire fed with oak and pitch, their shadows leaping like spirits across the stones. In the heart of the flame, the king carved a promise not to the heavens, but to the darkness that moved beneath it. He offered his blood and the breath of his firstborn in exchange for dominion. The hounds, they say, were his witnesses. From that night onward, strange things stirred across the valleys. The rain came without clouds, the rivers filled with foam, and in the forests, deer were found torn apart but uneaten, their tracks ringed by prints larger than any wolf. The king's men boasted that their master rode with the storm, that his mount was the wind itself, and his hounds ran before thunder. And for a time, it seemed true. His enemies fell before him like grass before a scythe. His banners reached the coast. But victory never comes without a cost. As the years turned, his people began to vanish. A herdsman asleep beside his flock would wake to find the sheep untouched, but his brother gone, his bed marked only by ash. A girl fetching water from the river would return with white hair and eyes that saw nothing. The hounds had begun to hunt the living, their master too far gone to call them back. It was said that on the coldest nights, the king himself could be heard crying out from the clouds a single word repeated through lightning and rain: oath. When death finally came for him, it came not from battle but from within. On the winter solstice, as the fires were lit, his heart seized in his chest. Witnesses claimed the wind stopped, the torches guttered, and all sound fled from the valley. Then came the howl, a sound so vast and hollow that every man fell to his knees. In the flash of lightning, they saw a figure rise from the pyre astride a black horse, surrounded by hounds wreathed in flame. The monks say his soul was carried to hell. The old folk say otherwise. They believe he still rides when storms return, hunting the oath-breakers, bound forever by the promise he made beneath the green sky. His name may be lost, but his vow endures, whispered through wind and thunder, carried by the hounds that have never stopped running. And on the wildest nights, when lightning splits the moors in two, his oath can still be heard, a cry not of victory, but of regret. The road cuts straight through the heart of the moor, a grey scar across heather and peat, older than the memory of villages, older even than the language of the stones. The Romans built it with the precision of their empire, each slab set in place, as if to defy time itself. They believed a straight road could tame the wild, that geometry could hold back ghosts, but the land was patient, and it waited. Long after the legions left, the road remained, stretching toward the horizon like a question that had never been answered. Travelers say that the road still hums when the mist rolls in. Beneath the wind, you can hear the faint cadence of marching feet, the echo of men who never found their way home. The stories tell of a legion that vanished here, a full cohort swallowed by the fog one autumn dawn. They had camped at the crossing near the old oak grove, torches set, shields stacked, their sentries watching the ridges. Yet when morning came, the fires still smouldered, but the soldiers were gone. Only their horses remained, eyes wild and mouths foaming with frost. Centuries later, farmers ploughing the edges of that same road unearthed their remnants: twisted bronze, fragments of sandals, teeth blackened by time. But the bones were wrong. The skulls were split as though gnawed upon, and every rib was marked by deep, precise punctures, as if bitten clean through. The priests declared it wolves. The old ones shook their heads and said, "Wolves do not leave the bones in lines, nor take only the heart." The road became cursed after that. No rider crossed it after dark. Even the mail coaches detoured, adding miles rather than touch its stones at night. In the half-light of dawn, shepherds sometimes saw movement along its length, not figures, but shapes, wavering as if made of mist. When the wind caught right, they swore they heard the jangle of iron, the creak of leather, and, beneath it all, a growl that was not human. The monks of Glaston wrote of it in their chronicles. The moor keeps what the empire could not. They believed the lost legion still marched in penance, doomed for the sins of conquest, hounded by the spirits they had tried to subdue. Yet others spoke of a darker thing, that one among the soldiers had broken a vow, desecrated a shrine left by the old tribes, and the wild hunt had claimed them all in retribution. To this day, the road is avoided when the moon is full. The stones glisten as though wet, and the air thickens until breath feels like water. On those nights, the sound returns rhythmic, measured, an army of ghosts marching nowhere. And if you listen closely, just before the echo fades, another noise rises from the moor, the deep, terrible chorus of hounds. Some claim they chase the legion still. Others believe the soldiers became them, condemned to run beside the wind they once tried to command. And so the road endures, straight and unbending, leading not to Rome, but into the endless silence where obedience and damnation sound the same. He was known only as the Huntsman of Wychmore, a man whose name no parish dared to record. The elders said he was born under a red moon, when the storms broke the trees and the hounds howled without cause. From his youth he hunted everything that lived: deer, boar, fox, even men who owed the Lord a debt. His dogs were fierce and lean, their eyes pale as glass, and their cries could be heard for miles. But it wasn't his cruelty that made the villagers whisper his name. It was that death refused to claim him. The story begins one winter morning, the kind where frost clings to every reed and even the sun seems too weak to rise. The huntsman was chasing a stag across the marsh when lightning struck the ridge. Witnesses said he fell where he stood, his body blackened, smoke rising from his horse. They buried him on the hill above the hollow, and the priest blessed the earth 3 times. Yet that night the dogs began to howl again, not from grief, but from joy. By dawn, hoofprints had appeared beside his grave, and the frost had melted in a perfect circle around it. A week later, a farmer's wife claimed she saw him riding through the fog, his face shadowed, his coat smoking at the seams. The hounds ran before him, silent now, their paws leaving no mark in the snow. She said he turned to her gate and raised a hand as if to greet her, and though she saw no wound, his skin glowed faintly from within, like embers trapped under ash. The woman lost her voice before morning and spoke no word again until she died. From then on, the huntsman appeared whenever thunder rolled over the moors. He hunted without prey, riding the wind, his horn echoing across the valleys. Some said he sought the stag that had led him to death. Others claimed he was cursed to ride forever for crimes no priest could absolve. Once, a knight from the lowlands swore he would break the curse. He rode into the storm carrying a silver crucifix and a torch of blessed pitch. The villagers heard his horn clash with another, a long, mournful note that tore through the night. At sunrise, only his horse returned, lathered in sweat, its saddle soaked in blood. There are those who believe the huntsman was no man at all, but something older wearing a man's shape, a remnant of the forest gods, banished by the coming of the cross. They say he feeds on oaths broken and promises left to rot. His hounds hunt not bodies, but guilt. When they bay outside a cottage door, it means someone inside has lied to heaven. Even now, when the storms crawl across Wychmore and the lightning forks over the ridge, the people stay inside and keep the hearth burning, because if the horn sounds from the dark low, long, and calling it means the huntsman rides again, and those who look out the window might see, just for an instant, a figure on horseback burning faintly like a coal that will never go out. The forest begins where the moor ends, a tangle of oak and yew so dense that even light seems reluctant to enter. The air there is still, close, and heavy with the smell of moss and iron. Travelers who pass through the edge trails swear the silence has weight, pressing against their skulls until their own breath sounds too loud. It's said the trees listen, and once they know your name, they do not forget it. Long before the monasteries marked maps with Latin ink, this forest was called the Listening Wood. The old tribes treated it as alive, not metaphorically, but in truth. They buried their dead at its roots and whispered their wishes into hollow trunks. When they felled trees for winter fuel, they spoke an apology first, cutting only what the forest allowed. To walk into those woods uninvited was to risk being remembered, because memory, here, was not mercy. Centuries later, when the roads were laid and the villages grew fat on trade, the woods were still avoided. Carpenters, who took timber from its heart, brought home wood that bled sap the color of rust. A baker's son wandered too deep one spring, chasing a lost goat. When he returned 3 days later, his hair had gone white. He said he'd heard voices calling him by name, sweetly at first, then as if through water. He hadn't slept since. The priest wrote in the parish ledger that the boy died of fright, though his skin bore no wound. Hunters who entered the forest alone often came back changed. Some were struck silent, others spoke in whispers not their own. A woodcutter from Ashcombe confessed that when his axe bit into an old yew, He heard a cry that did not belong to any living thing. He fled, leaving his tools behind. The next day, his wife found his footprints leading back into the woods. They ended at the base of a tree with roots shaped like reaching hands. The axe lay nearby, its blade buried in the earth, its handle pulsing faintly as if alive. The elders say the forest does not harm without cause. It waits, it listens, it learns the rhythm of your steps, the cadence of your breath, the sound of your name when it leaves your lips. It waits for the moment you speak that name too loudly, or forget to whisper a thank you when you pass beneath its canopy. Then, they say, it answers. Some hear their own voice echoed softly behind them. Others hear it whispered from the branches above. A few never hear anything at all, only the sudden absence of sound, the world holding its breath, and the faint impression that something vast has just leaned close enough to listen. Even now, in the far corners of the countryside, people lower their voices when they pass a yew or ash that grows too close to the path. Children are told to never say their names aloud in the woods, not even to call for help, because once the forest learns it, it will whisper it back, not tonight, not tomorrow, but years from now, on a windless evening, when the world is still enough for the trees to remember. And when it does, you'll hear it softly spoken, in your own voice, from somewhere just behind you. In the far north of England, where the hills drop into fog and the coal pits yawn like open graves, the people of Easington Lane still speak of a hound that walks the road alone. They call it the Black Dog, though no one dares to say the name after dark. It appears without warning, sometimes beside a lonely traveller, sometimes in the glare of a miner's lamp, and always vanishes before the dawn. Those who see it live, but those who follow it are never seen again. The first written account comes from the parish records of 1723. A night watchman named Elias Croft reported hearing footsteps behind him on the turnpike after midnight. When he turned, he saw the shape of a great black dog keeping pace beside him. Its coat shone like oil, and its eyes burned the color of coal fresh from the seam. Croft claimed it walked silently, yet he could hear a faint panting sound, slow, deliberate, as though the beast were measuring his fear. He reached for his lantern, but the flame died. Instant he raised it. By the time it flickered back, the dog was gone. The next morning, Croft's hair had turned white at the temples. Miners who worked the pits told their own stories. Some swore the dog guarded the entrances, pacing above ground before a cave-in or explosion. Others said it was the soul of a man who'd been buried alive decades before, condemned to watch over those who descended into the earth. There are even accounts of miners being saved, a tunnel collapsing seconds after a spectral hound's howl warned them to flee. For a time, the Black Dog was feared and worshipped in equal measure, a dark guardian whose loyalty belonged to the dead, not the living. Yet the tales grew stranger. In 1846, a child vanished from the village after chasing what he thought was a stray dog into the fields. Search parties found his footprints circling the same patch of ground, round and round, until they simply stopped. No prints led away, and no grass was bent. The vicar held a service that Sunday, and forbade any mention of the creature thereafter. But the following winter, when the snow came thick and the miners' lamps glowed through the mist, the dog was seen again trotting through the churchyard, its breath steaming, its paws leaving no impression in the snow. Over the years, travelers began to treat the sighting as an omen. If the dog walked beside you without meeting your eye, it meant safety, your path was clear. But if it looked at you directly, its gaze holding yours like iron, you were marked. Within a week, an accident would come, sometimes a fall in the mines, sometimes a sickness, never immediate but certain. Today, lorry drivers still claim to glimpse it on the old road, where the lamps flicker for no reason and the air smells faintly of coal. The legend says it's neither ghost nor demon, but something between a soul caught in the seam between worlds, loyal to the dirt that buried it. And when it walks beside you, step for step, the wise do not run. They bow their heads and whisper thanks, For not all hounds that haunt the dark are hungry, some only remember who they used to protect. There is a hill outside the village of Dartmoor Vale, where no lanterns burn after dusk. The grass grows thin there, pale and soft as hair, and in the cold months a strange light flickers just above the ground, a single flame that sways without wind. The locals call it the shepherd's candle. It burns brightest when someone is about to die. The first story comes from a shepherd named Willan Hobb, whose flock grazed those slopes in the early 1700s. One winter night, as frost crept down the hills, he saw what he thought was a lamp bobbing near the stream. Thinking a traveller had lost his way, he followed it, calling out into the dark. But the light kept moving, never closer, always just ahead. When his dog refused to follow, whining and clawing at the earth, Hobb returned home uneasy. The next morning, they found his neighbour, another shepherd, frozen stiff by that same stream. The light had hovered above his body until dawn, then winked out as the sun rose. After that, the villagers kept watch on storm nights. The light came again and again, sometimes blue, sometimes gold, never steady. When it burned near the churchyard, someone inside the village would fall ill before sunrise. When it drifted toward the fields, the sheep would panic, herding themselves tight as if against invisible wolves. No one dared to chase it anymore. The elders said it was not flame at all, but the breath of a soul leaving the body, a warning sent by the moor to those who would listen. One winter, a traveling priest tried to bless the hill. He carried holy water and a silver cross, confident in the light of God. They say he prayed for hours, his voice echoing down the slopes, until the air grew thick and silent. Then the candle appeared brighter than ever before, hovering at chest height, its flame steady against the wind. The priest raised his cross, but the metal blackened in his hands. When the villagers found him the next morning, he was kneeling upright in the fainting, snow, eyes open, lips burnt to ash. The ground beneath him smelled faintly of tallow and salt. For generations after, the hill was left untouched. Sheep would graze around it, but never upon it. Children were told that if they saw the light, they must look away and speak no word, for to name it was to summon it closer. Still, there were always those who didn't believe. In 1921, two brothers from Exeter brought electric lamps to prove it was nothing more than marsh gas. Their equipment was found 3 days later, lamps shattered, metal warped by heat, but no sign of the brothers. The police called it misadventure. The locals called it proof. Even now, hikers report a glow above the moor when the fog drifts low and the air turns still. Some mistake it for a phone light, others for stars reflected in dew, but those who have lived there longest know better. They say the shepherd's candle doesn't guide, it watches. It waits for a soul too weary to resist its warmth. And when the last breath leaves the body, that little flame flickers once, bends to the earth, and goes dark, as if the moor itself has snuffed it out. It begins, they say, on nights when the moon hides itself, when the sky is neither black nor blue, but the color of iron, and the air trembles before a storm. In the high valleys between Yorkshire and Durham, an ancient sound rolls through the hills, a single horn, low and mournful, blown once, always at midnight. No one knows who sounds it. No one has ever seen the man or thing that holds it. But the people count the nights between each call, and they swear the land remembers. The earliest mention appears in a 13th century charter from a Benedictine monastery near Re-Volks. It records that on the feast of St. Thomas, while the monks chanted the midnight office, a horn most dreadful did sound thrice over the vale, shaking the windows and the hearts of men. The abbot sent riders to search the woods, but the snow bore no prints, not hoof, nor foot, nor paw. One novice claimed to have seen a pale figure on the ridge, holding a curved horn of bone, but when questioned, he fainted and could not be roused until morning. Over the centuries, the horn became omen and warning alike. In the plague years, its call was heard each time a cart rolled through town, the dead heaped beneath white sheets. During the Wars of the Roses, soldiers stationed in the north said it sounded before every ambush, as if some unseen herald rode ahead of death itself. It never came from the same direction twice. Sometimes it echoed from the moors, sometimes from the sky. Always it was close enough to feel in the chest, a vibration rather than a sound, as if the hills themselves had taken breath and remembered how to mourn. In 1794, a group of antiquarians from Newcastle ventured out with instruments to measure its echo. They camped near the ruins of an old watchtower, determined to prove it a trick of weather. Their journals were later found half buried in peat. The pages told of clear skies, still air, and silence until midnight, when the horn sounded directly above. One man wrote that the air folded inward, and I felt my heart cease. Another recorded that his lantern shattered without flame. None of the expedition returned. Locals said the moor swallowed them whole. In modern times, a handful of witnesses claim to have recorded the horn brief bursts of low frequency caught on tape near midnight. Yet the sound is always followed by static, the kind that distorts speech and drains light from the image. Some believe it is the wild hunt's summons, calling the dead to ride once more. Others say it is the breath of the land itself, exhaling the memories it cannot bury. When it sounds, livestock go silent, and dogs hide beneath their masters' beds. Those who live near the valleys close their shutters and count the seconds until it fades. But there are always a few who listen, waiting for it to sound again, daring to hear what follows in the pause. And in that silence, some swear they catch the faintest echo of hoofbeats, growing nearer, as if answering the horn's call across centuries, the beginning of a chase that never ends. They say she walks only when the mist settles low enough to touch the grass, a white shape drifting along the hollow lane between the churchyard and the mill. The air turns colder when she passes, though her feet never touch the ground. No one speaks to her, and no one dares to follow, because every soul in the parish knows who she is, and what she lost on the night she was meant to be wed. The story begins in 1812, when a miller's daughter named Eliza Harland was to marry a farmer's son from the next village. Their families had arranged the match since childhood, and the whole valley gathered for the wedding feast. But as the night wore on, a storm gathered over the moor. The wind howled through the rafters, rattling the shutters like chains. When the guests looked for Eliza, she was gone, last seen walking toward the lane that led through the hollow. They found her veil snagged on a thorn bush, and one of her shoes in the mud. The rest was silence. The search went on for days. They dragged the stream, turned the fields, even dug into the embankments, thinking the flood had buried her. Nothing. The vicar preached that she had run off in shame, that love had driven her to folly. But the older folk whispered of a sound that had carried through the wind that night, the baying of hounds, low and unearthly, coming from the hollow itself. A month later, the first sighting came. A carter passing the lane at midnight saw a figure standing in the mist, wearing what looked like a bridal gown, its hem darkened with earth. He called out, thinking she was lost. She turned, slowly, and her face was the color of candle wax, her mouth moving though no sound came. The man fled, leaving his horse and cart behind. When he returned at dawn, both were gone. Only the wheel tracks remained, circling the hollow once before vanishing into the reeds. Over the years, others saw her always in fog, always near the same place. The dress never aged, but her veil grew thinner, as if dissolving with each appearance. Some said she waited for her groom, others believed she was taken by the huntsman, claimed as a bride for the dead. Children were warned not to stray into the hollow after dark, yet every decade or so, someone would vanish there. The police wrote it off as misadventure, but the villagers knew better. They say if you walk that road on a misty night and hear faint weeping behind you, do not turn. Keep your eyes forward and your breath steady, for if you look back, you'll see her not walking, but gliding, her veil trailing through the grass like smoke, her eyes fixed on yours as if she's finally found the man she was meant to marry. And should she reach you, The hounds will come next, unseen, circling, their breath cold as the grave. When morning comes, the mist will lift, the lane will be empty, and the echo of a woman's sob will linger on the wind, soft, steady, and eternal, as if the hollow itself still mourns its bride. There are places in England where the deer move like ghosts, pale shapes slipping between the trees, their hooves barely touching the earth. But none are so feared, or so sacred, as the White Hart of Fensmere Wood. For centuries, its appearance was taken as a sign of plague, of famine, of the death of kings. To see it was a blessing, they said. To kill, it was a curse. The first tale is carved into the oak screen of the old chapel at Fensmere, its figures worn smooth by centuries of fingertips. It tells of Lord Anselm de Vere, a Norman noble who claimed the forest as his own. He forbade the peasants to hunt there and hung poachers from the gatehouse as warnings. But one spring morning, as he rode through the wood, he saw a white stag grazing in a shaft of sunlight, its antlers gleaming like polished bone. It did not flee at his approach. Instead, it lifted its head and stared, as if daring him to act. Anselm loosed his arrow before his men could stop him. The shaft flew true, striking the stag through the heart. Yet instead of falling, the creature turned and bounded into the trees, the arrow still quivering in its side. The lord gave chase, but by the time his horse cleared the ridge, the stag had vanished. What he found instead was his own reflection in a pool of red water, his face pale, his eyes hollow. When his men reached him, he was on his knees, clutching his chest. The wound that had slain the deer had appeared in his own flesh. He died before sunset, and the body of the stag was never found. After that day, no hunter entered Fensmere Wood without whispering a prayer. But the curse did not rest. Each generation brought another foolhardy man who thought himself immune. A squire shot at the creature and found his hounds dead by morning, their mouths foaming with blood. A gamekeeper set traps, and his own son was caught in one, crushed and broken in the dark. By the Victorian age, the White Hart had become legend, yet sightings persisted, pale, eyes flashing in moonlight, hoofprints that glowed faintly before vanishing with the dawn. In 1932, a motorist driving through the forest at night swerved to avoid something standing in the road, a great stag, he said, white as frost, its antlers wreathed in mist. His car crashed into a tree, killing him instantly. When the police arrived, there were no tracks on the road, only a single drop of blood on the hood, bright against the cold metal. Even now, hunters whisper of a shape that moves among the trees when the fog rolls in, silent, unafraid, always watching. They say it guards the old forest, punishing those who trespass with greed in their hearts. The villagers leave offerings of salt and bread at the edge of the wood each winter, hoping to appease whatever spirit wears the White Hart's skin. And when the wind carries the echo of hooves through the branches, no one speaks. They bow their heads, step aside, and let the curse pass through, for the White Hart of Fensmere walks still, and it never forgets the man who dared to draw blood first. They say the fire that ended the old gods did not die cleanly. It smouldered in the cracks of ruined temples and drifted like breath beneath the soil. When the monks built their chapels atop those sacred places, the earth still remembered the songs, the blood, the bargains made in smoke. The villagers called it the ash ground, and though the priests burned what they called idols, the ashes never cooled. The hill of Latchmere was one such place. Before the Norman lords came, it was known as Blot Hill, where offerings were left each winter, solstice milk for the land, honey for the bees, and a drop of blood for whatever spirit kept the crops alive. When the cross replaced the old stones, the villagers obeyed, but uneasily. The new priest ordered the pyre built high, the old relics thrown upon it, carved horns, bones etched with runes, and a wooden mask said to speak in dreams. They stood around the fire, faces half lit, watching the past turn to flame. But as the blaze rose, something changed in the air. The wind shifted, drawing smoke back down the hill, curling it around their feet. It smelled not of wood or pitch, but of iron, and rain. The priest held his cross higher, shouting the Latin verses, but his words broke under the roar. A scream came from the fire, not human, not animal, something in between. When morning came, the pyre was ash, the relics gone, and the priest's hair had turned the color of snow. In the years that followed, the land soured, crops blackened overnight, livestock miscarried in the fields. The villagers blamed the devil at first, then the priest himself. He fasted, prayed, burned incense, until the church walls were black. Yet each night, he heard whispers under the altar, voices he did not understand, rising and falling like the rhythm of tide. One night, desperate, he lifted a tile from the floor and found the earth beneath still warm to the touch. When plague swept the countryside, the chapel was abandoned. Travelers spoke of seeing faint embers glowing through the cracks of its ruined walls, as if the fire beneath had never gone out. A farmer who tried to clear the land said his plow hit something hard. He dug for hours before uncovering a mound of fused ash and bone, still faintly smoking though rain fell all around. He covered it again and left the field to the weeds. Even now, the hill remains bare, nothing growing where the chapel once stood. On some nights, the wind carries a bitter scent, sharp and metallic, like burnt blood. Locals swear that if you stand there after dark, you'll see a faint light below the soil, pulsing softly, as if the old gods still breathe under the ash. And if you listen long enough, you might hear the crackle of fire not in the air, but deep in the ground, feeding on memory, waiting for someone foolish enough to stir the embers, because faith may burn, but it never disappears. It only waits to be remembered. Every village in England has a crossroads, but few remember why they were built that way. 4 roads meeting where the wind never settles, a place where boundaries blur. In older times, they buried suicides there, far from consecrated ground, believing the restless could not find their way back home if they were laid at a place where every path led elsewhere. Yet at the crossroads outside Bracken Hollow, there is something older still, a shape that waits where the roads meet, where no grass grows and no bird ever lands. The first mention comes from a coroner's roll dated 1578. A carter named Edwin Dale was found at the junction, his cart overturned, his horses vanished. His body was untouched, no wound, no bruise, but his face was frozen in terror, his eyes wide and black as pitch. The record notes that a lantern, curious and unearthly bright, was found near the corpse. It was taken to the church for examination, but by morning it had vanished, leaving a circle of soot upon the vestry floor. Centuries later, the story lingered. Travelers spoke of a figure standing at the crossroads on moonless nights, cloaked, unmoving, a light in its hand that swayed, though no wind blew. Those who passed without greeting were left untouched, but those who stopped, drawn by curiosity or pity, were found dead by dawn, faces pale, their hearts stopped as though gripped by frost. Locals began leaving offerings of bread or salt where the roads met, whispering, "Keep your light and let us pass." An antiquarian from London, writing in 1839, tried to dismiss it as superstition. He camped by the crossroads one autumn night with pen, lantern, and flask. In his diary, recovered weeks later from the ditch, he described a low humming sound not in the air, but in his bones. Then the light appeared, a lantern or orb, held by no hand, swinging gently before me. His final line reads, "It wants to know my road." His body was never found. In time, villagers gave the figure a name they dared not speak aloud, the Watcher of the Ways. They believed it was not a ghost, but a collector, something bound to the space between choices, gathering the souls of those who hesitate too long. The old women said it fed on indecision, that a moment's pause at the crossing was enough to draw its attention. Even now, truck drivers on the back roads of Northumberland report strange lights that dance ahead of them, guiding their headlights toward the junction. Some swear the air goes cold as they approach, their radios filling with static and whispering voices. A few have seen the figure itself, a tall outline holding what looks like a lantern made of bone, its glow pale and pulsing, as though alive. If you ever find yourself at a lonely crossroads, and a light appears where no one stands, do not stop. Keep walking. Choose a path, any path, and do not look back, because the thing that waits there hungers only for those who linger, and, once it learns your hesitation, it will wait for you at every crossing after, its light flickering closer each time you lose your way. There's a silence in the valley of Winthorpe that no bird dares disturb. The church bell hasn't rung in 200 years, and the villagers who remain do not speak the Lord's Prayer. They cross themselves backward, burn no candles, and bolt their doors when the wind comes down from the hills. Outsiders call it superstition, but those who live there remember the year the prayers stopped and what answered them when they didn't. It began with the storm of 1714, the one that split the steeple and burned half the village roofs. The vicar, Reverend Lyle, declared it punishment for waning faith and commanded a week of prayer. Each night, the villagers gathered in the church, the air thick with incense and fear. On the 5th night, just as the prayers reached their peak, the wind dropped. The air went still as glass. Then came a knocking sound, not at the door, but from beneath the floorboards of the nave. They thought it was rats at first, or water shifting in the stone. But the noise grew louder, rhythmic, as if mimicking their recitations. When they paused, it paused. When they prayed louder, it pounded harder. The floor trembled, the candles guttered out, and someone screamed that they smelled iron like blood. Reverend Lyle shouted for courage and struck the floor with his staff, calling on heaven to cast the devil out. The knocking stopped, but the next morning the church was filled with flies. From that night on, the prayers changed. No matter how loudly they were spoken, the echoes beneath the church spoke them back in reverse. Words meant to save twisted into something hollow and cold. "Deliver us from evil," came back as a whisper. "Deliver evil unto us." The vicar forbade further gatherings, but by then it was too late. Cows birthed calves with no eyes, the river ran brown with dead fish, and the children began waking in the night, their mouths full of ash. Reverend Lyle burned the church records, sealed the crypt, and ordered the bell removed. Yet still the floor pulsed faintly, as though something beneath was breathing. He wrote one final sermon, never spoken aloud, found years later among his belongings. "We called to heaven, and it was not heaven that replied." The next morning, his house stood empty. The only sign of him was a trail of footprints leading from his door to the church and ending at the chancel, where the boards were warped, as though something had pressed upward from below. No one rebuilt the steeple. No priest ever came again. The villagers simply stopped praying. They sealed the church, let it rot, and built their homes facing away from it. Travelers who pass through Winthorpe today say the old church still stands, half buried by ivy, its door nailed shut. But if you put your ear to the wood, you'll hear a faint sound from within, a steady knocking, like hands striking stone in rhythm with a prayer long since forgotten. And if you whisper a blessing there, something will. Whisper it back, only backward, slower, and far too close to your ear. The first footprints appeared at dawn, deep, narrow impressions stretching from the cliff path to the frozen stream, crossing fields, walls, and even rooftops without pause. The villagers of Denscombe woke to find them etched perfectly into the snow, as though pressed by something small and light, yet impossibly precise. Each print measured the same length, 4 inches, cleft like a goat's hoof, but no goat could walk in straight lines across fences, nor leave no trail of entry or exit. It was February of 1855, and the storm had howled through the night. The snow was fresh, undisturbed, until morning revealed the marks winding for miles through Devon's countryside. The local vicar called it the work of a hoaxer, though how a man could have leapt walls 12 feet high remained unanswered. Others said it was the devil himself, come to claim what belonged to him. But the old women whispered a different tale, one that had lingered since before the church was built. They said the hounds of the hunt had passed through in silence, seeking a soul that had fled its proper grave. Children followed the tracks with sticks, tracing their endless path until they vanished at the edge of the river, only to begin again on the far bank. Men with rifles watched from their doors, afraid to step outside. Dogs refused to leave their kennels, whining and biting at the air. By noon, the whole valley had gathered at the crossroads where the prince divided, one path leading toward the moor, the other toward the churchyard. The priest tried to bless the snow, sprinkling holy water in a trembling hand. The drops froze where they fell, leaving dark stains like burns. That night, the villagers locked their doors, but the marks returned, now pressed into the snow on rooftops, window ledges, even across the slate tiles of the church itself. The vicar heard scraping on the roof above his bed, followed by a sound like distant breathing. In the morning, the tracks were there, again, beginning directly outside his window, ending at the cemetery gate. Beneath the snow, one grave had sunk slightly, its soil disturbed. When spring came, the thaw revealed strange grooves carved into the earth beneath the frost pairs of lines, perfectly parallel, as though something with cloven feet had burned its way through the ground. The disturbed grave belonged to a poacher named Edmund Rawle, hanged for killing a gamekeeper the year before. His coffin was empty. Since then, whenever the snow falls deep and the wind carries no sound, villagers claim the prince's return. Not as many, not as long, just a handful near the church, circling the same patch of ground. They appear overnight, without sound, without weight, and vanish when touched. No birds sing on those mornings, and the frost seems to hum faintly, like distant horn calls buried under the wind. They say it's the hounds still hunting the poacher, or the devil reclaiming his due. But sometimes, when the moon is low and the snow glows blue beneath it, the prints lead nowhere. They simply stop, mid-step, as if whatever made them had risen into the air. And the silence that follows is worse than the storm, because it feels like something is still there, just waiting for the snow to fall again. At the northern edge of Blackmere Common, where the ground turns to peat and the fog never lifts, a single oak stands twisted against the sky. Its branches grow downward instead of up, as if dragged toward the earth by the weight of memory. The villagers call it the gallows tree. No one planted it. No one dares to cut it down, and they say the man who watches over it was hanged there himself, yet never truly died. The earliest record dates to 1669, when Blackmere was still a place of trials and burnings. The sheriff's men used that tree to hang thieves, debtors, and the occasional witch. The branches seemed to bend willingly for the rope, and the wood never cracked under the weight. By order of the crown, a keeper was assigned to tend the executions, bury the condemned, and burn their possessions. He was known only as Corbin, a silent man who lived alone in a hut beside the marsh. Witnesses wrote that he spoke to no one but the dead, whispering prayers as he cut them down. When plague struck the village, the gallows fell silent for a season. But in the spring that followed, the bodies buried near the oak began to rise, not as men, but as shapes pressed against the soil, their outlines faintly glowing under moonlight. The villagers accused Corbin of witchcraft, claiming he'd bound the souls of the hanged to guard his field. They stormed his hut, dragged him to the tree he had tended for 20 years, and looped a rope around his neck. He did not resist. They buried him beneath the gallows, but by the next morning, the rope hung empty. Only his boots remained, half sunk in the mud. A year later, when the new keeper went to light his lantern at dusk, he saw a figure already standing beneath the tree, tall, thin, wearing those same boots. The man's face was grey as ash, and his eyes burned faintly like coals. Without a word, he lifted his hand to the branch, as if testing its weight. The new keeper fled, and from that night on, no one took the job again. Centuries passed, but the gallows never rotted. When storms swept the moor, lightning struck every tree but that one. The villagers noticed strange patterns in the soil, shallow footprints circling the trunk, too regular to be animal, too light to be man. On nights before an execution anywhere in the county, a light was seen beneath the oak, a lantern swinging on its own, casting no shadow. By morning, the wind would carry the faint creak of a rope swaying, though nothing hung from it. They say Corbin became the keeper still, condemned to watch the dead he once served. His duty did not end with life. It deepened. If you stand at the edge of Blackmere and call his name, the fog will thicken, and you'll hear the rustle of boots through wet grass. Some claim he guards the restless, keeping their souls from wandering too far. Others say he waits for company for the next man who dares to spill blood on cursed ground. And if you linger too long, when the mist closes around you, you'll hear the rope tighten above your head, slow, deliberate, as though the keeper himself were drawing it taut once more. In the wide green fields beyond Wiltcombe, an ancient mound rises alone, smooth as a sleeping hill, capped with gorse and brittle grass. The farmers call it the Barrow of 10 Tongues. No one ploughs near it, no sheep graze upon it, and on still nights the earth itself seems to hum. The sound is faint, low, steady, like wind caught inside stone, but if you listen too long, it begins to shape itself into words. The mound was old when Rome was young. The first settlers buried their dead there, warriors and chieftains wrapped in hides, their weapons beside them, their mouths filled with coins for the journey beneath. Centuries later, when the monks came, they built a cross atop the hill to sanctify it, but the soil refused the symbol. Every morning the cross would be found leaning, its base blackened as if scorched from within. After the third night, the abbot ordered it abandoned, declaring the ground unbaptized by nature. No one dared disturb the mound again until 1798, when a local squire, eager for fame, hired laborers to dig for treasure. They struck bone before noon, then metal, then something like a chamber, a vault lined with stone, its air heavy as old breath. The men broke through, and the first sound that escaped was not a sigh, but a chorus faint, many-voiced, rising and falling like chanting underwater. One worker fled and was never seen again. The others lowered a lantern, and the flame shrank, dimming to a blue spark. Inside were bones, hundreds of them arranged upright, as if the dead had been buried standing, facing inward toward a black stone altar. Upon it lay a single skull, its jaw open wide as if mid-speech. They sealed the chamber by dusk, but the noise followed them home. Every night, the squire's house trembled with whispers, his mirrors clouded from within. By the end of the month he was found in his study, writing the same phrase over and over. "We are not gone. We are waiting for the word." His hand was stiff, his ink long dry. After that, the villagers filled the entrance with stones and planted thorn over it. Yet the hum beneath the earth never ceased. On winter nights, when the wind drops, you can still hear it faintly from the road, a vibration that quivers through your boots and settles in your bones. Those who linger too long say the voices shift, that the words become clear enough to understand. Names, dates, prayers, older than English, and once you hear your own name whispered among them, it never leaves your ear. Scholars who've come to study the Barrow bring recorders and measuring devices. None capture sound. The microphones buzz, then fall silent, as if the air itself refuses to translate what's said. But the locals know better. They say the mound isn't haunted, it's alive, breathing with the weight of all it holds. Each voice belongs to a soul that was never laid to rest, still speaking beneath the soil, still waiting for the one who will listen long enough to answer back. And when that listener comes, the voices will not whisper anymore. They will rise all 10,000 tongues until the hill itself opens to speak. Across the flat, waterlogged fields of the Norfolk fens, where the reeds sway like hair and the earth smells of salt and rot, the locals tell of a wandering light. It moves low to the ground, too small to be a lantern and too bright to be a star. It drifts along the ditches and bogs, flickering as if carried by an unseen hand. They call it the Lantern Man. The oldest account comes from a ferryman's journal dated 1000, 671, he wrote of a night crossing when a blue light floated across the marsh, keeping pace with his boat. His passengers swore it was a spirit guarding lost souls, but the ferryman thought otherwise. "It moves with thought," he wrote, "not with the wind." When they reached the opposite shore, the light paused upon the water, glowing brighter, until it burst a flash that lit the fen like daylight. The ferryman was found the next morning, his boat drifting empty. His passenger was never recovered. For generations, the lantern man was treated as an omen. If the Karpi's light approached, it meant death in the village within 3 nights. Yet some believed it could be summoned to reveal buried things, gold, corpses, or truth. During the famine of 1783, a miller's wife, desperate for her missing husband, walked the fen with a candle in hand, calling the lantern man's name. They found her the next day, standing waist-deep in the mud, her candle still burning in the water. Behind her, in the reeds, lay her husband's drowned body, face turned upward, eyes reflecting the same blue glow. By the Victorian era, the story had changed. Scholars dismissed it as marsh gas willow, the wisps, they said, born of decay. But the villagers kept their distance. A constable sent to investigate reported following the light one autumn night, convinced it was the prank of smugglers. The mist grew so thick he could barely see his own hands. The light hovered just ahead, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Then, without sound, it split into 3, surrounding him. The constable ran. When he reached the road, his hair was singed and his face blistered, as if burned by cold fire. He left Norfolk the next day and never spoke of it again. Even now, the fen keeps its secret. On windless nights, the marsh glows faintly, rippling as though breathing. Walkers who wander too close to the pools sometimes see the light rise from the water, dancing ahead as if beckoning them onward. They follow, thinking it's a house lamp or a friend's torch, until the ground gives way beneath their feet. By morning, only ripples remain, spreading in widening circles across the still black water. The old folk say the lantern man is not a ghost but a punishment, a soul that once lured others to their deaths, now doomed to guide without rest. If you see his light on the fen, look away, bow your head, and keep to dry ground. For when the lantern man chooses you, he does not chase. He waits, and sooner or later, every lost traveller must follow the light. In the hamlet of Thornmere, there's a field no one ploughs anymore, a sloping meadow bordered by poplars that whisper even when there's no wind. The soil there is rich and dark, but nothing grows right. Crows avoid it, horses shy at its edge. The villagers call it the Farmer's Walk, though few remember the man whose footsteps gave it the name. His name was Thomas Gray, a tenant farmer in the year 1819. A quiet, steady man, known for his fields of barley and his habit of working long after sunset. That autumn was strange, the air too warm, the sky too still, and the dogs barking for no reason at night. Thomas laughed it off, though his wife swore she saw lights moving across the hedgerows, small as candle flames, vanishing when she called. On the night he disappeared, a storm was brewing. Thomas went out to bring the last sheaves into the barn. The wind died the moment he crossed the field, leaving the whole valley breathless. His wife watched from the window, a lantern in her hand. She saw him stop, mid-step, his head turning as if he'd heard something behind him. Then, though the ground was dry, he sank knee-deep into the soil, as if the earth had softened just for him. He cried out once, a sound lost in the rising wind, and was gone. At dawn, the villagers came to search. They found no body, no hole, no sign of struggle, only footprints. Deep, even prints that began at the barn door and crossed the field in a perfect line. They ended abruptly near the center. The last 2 pressed sharply into the ground, toes pointing toward the horizon. The prints were filled with water, though the night had seen no rain. When one man tried to measure them, his ruler cracked in half. They waited a day, then another, but the ground refused to yield. No tools would break it, The priest blessed the soil, and the water in the prints began to boil. They covered the field with stones and declared it cursed. Yet on the following spring night, when the moon was high, the prints returned not as indentations, but as faint rises, the earth swelling upward in the same shape. Through the years that followed, others heard him walking. The sound would come from the dark, slow, deliberate steps pacing the edge of the field. The rhythm never faltered, even when the wind howled or the rain fell in sheets. A few who dared to follow said the sound stopped the moment they stepped onto the soil, as if something below were listening. In time, the meadow swallowed every crop planted there. Only grass grows now pale and coarse, shivering without breeze. On certain nights, when the mist drifts low, the footprints rise again, filled with dim light, like reflections from an unseen moon. And if you stand too close, the earth trembles beneath your feet, as though someone is still walking beneath it, still trying to finish a harvest that will never end. On the cliffs above the river stand the ruins of Greyvale Priory, black arches and hollow windows, where the wind sings like a choir without words. The monks who once lived there are long gone, their bones scattered beneath the grass. But the valley keeps their secret, and the walls still seem to remember the sound that broke their silence, the night the wild hunt rode through the cloisters. The priory was founded in the 12th century by men seeking solitude. They chose that valley for its quiet, for the mist that dulled the world to whispers. For a time, it was peaceful days of prayer, nights of chanting. Then came the winter of 1283, colder than any before. The river froze, and the bells cracked from frost. The brothers prayed for mercy, their breath turning to smoke before their lips. And one night, as they knelt in the chapel, they heard hoofbeats. At first, they thought it thunder. The sound rolled across the valley, then climbed the hill until it filled the church, like a storm contained in stone. The abbot sent 2 novices to the door, but before they reached it, the great oak gate burst inward. Wind and snow poured through the aisle, and with it, the faint glow of torches. The brothers saw nothing at first, only light and motion, a blur of white shapes sweeping past. Then came the hounds, lean, silver grey, their eyes burning like coals, their breath steaming against the cold air. They ran between the pews without sound, their paws leaving no mark on the flagstones. Behind them rode a figure in dark armor, its visor lowered, its cloak whipping like smoke. The monks fell to the floor in terror. The abbot tried to raise his voice in prayer, but his words turned hollow in his mouth. The figure rode straight through him, its form half light, half shadow, leaving frost on his robes and a silence so deep the air seemed to freeze. When the wind ceased, the doors swung shut on their own. Every candle had burned out. By dawn, the abbot was dead, his face serene, his hands folded as if in benediction. The monks buried him in the cloister, but that night they heard the sound again, hooves clattering over the stone floor, dogs panting, a horn blowing somewhere far and near at once. The brothers took turns keeping vigil, but the hunt returned each night, louder, faster. The riders unseen, but their passage felt like pressure on the chest. In spring, the remaining monks abandoned the priory, leaving their vows and their god behind. Travelers who pass the ruins today still hear the echoes on cold nights, hoofbeats across empty stone, a horn rising from the mist, and sometimes the faint chanting of men trying to pray through fear. Those who enter the chapel at midnight swear the air changes, thickens, like breath pressed against glass. They hear the dogs panting, circling unseen. Then the horn blows once, long and low, shaking dust from the rafters. And for a heartbeat, the shadows move like riders, galloping through time, itself monks and huntsmen sharing the same endless chase, trapped forever in the moment the divine met the damned. The abbey at Faversham had many legends, but none so enduring as the story of the hound that guarded its yard. The monks said it came from nowhere, appearing one autumn dawn, black as soot, sitting at the gate as though waiting for entry. Its fur was coarse and dull, its eyes the color of rain clouds. It never barked, never slept, never ate. Yet every night, When the bells rang for matins, it was there among them, pacing the cloisters in silence. They called it the brother's dog, though none could say which brother it belonged to. It was Brother Stephen who first noticed what others had missed. The dog cast no shadow. The candlelight passed through it, leaving the walls untouched. He told the abbot, who frowned and ordered the matter kept quiet. They had seen too many strange things since the hunt rode through their valley, and fear was a contagion that spread faster than plague. Still, the monks began to avoid the creature. It followed them from cell to chapel, from garden to refectory, its paws soundless against the stone. When the abbot died that winter, the brothers buried him in the churchyard at dawn. As they lowered the coffin, the dog sat beside the open grave, its head tilted as if listening. When the last shovel of earth was cast, it stood, turned once around the mound, and walked toward the gate. No one saw it leave. By vespers, it was waiting in the cloister again, its fur glistening with dew. The next morning, one of the novices vanished. His cell door was open, his bed neatly made. Only his sandals remained placed side by side at the threshold. That night, the dog appeared by the chapel door, mud caked to its paws. Its eyes seemed lighter now, almost human. The prior sprinkled holy water on the flagstones where it walked, but the droplets hissed, and a faint smell of sulphur filled the air. After that, the monks began to hear breathing in the dark, sometimes soft, sometimes ragged, always close. The dog's shape lingered in the corners of their vision, though no light ever touched it. The prior declared it a demon, and fasted for 7 days. On the 8th, his voice was found echoing in the nave, repeating a single phrase, "He walks without shadow because the sun will not claim him." The abbey fell to ruin within a year. Some fled, others went mad. Yet travelers who pass the site still report seeing a dark form moving among the gravestones. They say it looks like a stray dog, silent and watchful, waiting for something. Those who approach describe an impossible cold, as though the air itself pulls inward, and when the moon is high and the mist settles low, it steps into view, fur black as ink, eyes grey as twilight. If you look closely, you'll see it's not the darkness that surrounds it, it's the absence of everything else. No reflection, no outline, no shadow, just a hollow where light refuses to exist, keeping vigil among the dead. They still whisper about her in the low villages along the Dorset coast, the woman who spoke to the storm and made it listen. Her name was Eleanor Pike, though the people called her the widow of Greystone. She lived alone on the cliff's edge, where the wind never stopped moaning, and the sea chewed at the rock like something hungry. Her husband, a sailor, had drowned 3 winters before, his ship torn apart by a squall that rose without warning. They never found his body, only his ring, washed ashore days later, bent out of shape. Every night after, Eleanor walked the cliff path with a lantern, calling his name into the dark. The villagers pitied her at first, but pity turned to fear when the lantern began to move on its own, swinging ahead of her like a guide. On certain nights, when lightning lit the waves, people saw another figure beside her, tall, indistinct, gliding at her pace. The widow never looked at it. She simply kept walking, her bare feet bleeding against the stones, whispering her prayers to something that listened. Then came the night of her bargain. A gale unlike any before rose from the sea, ripping roofs from cottages, dragging boats from their moorings. Eleanor stood at the edge of the cliff, her lantern blazing white instead of gold. Those who watched from the village said she was speaking, not shouting, but speaking, calm as if in conversation. When the wind broke suddenly, the clouds parted, and a single streak of moonlight struck the water. A shape moved there vast, like a hound made of mist, its eyes the color of the tide. Then the sea fell still. The storm ended as quickly as it began. By morning, the widow's cottage was empty. Her bed was made, her shoes by the hearth. Only the lantern remained, still burning without oil. The villagers buried it at the chapel gate, thinking to lay her spirit to rest. But the next storm brought her back. Fishermen saw her walking the beach, the lantern swinging from her hand. With her came the smell of brine and iron, and the waves rose as if bowing. From that day, her name was both curse and prayer. Those lost at sea called on her when hope was gone, and sometimes their ships returned, sails torn but men alive. Others invoked her in anger, begging her to drag their enemies down. More than once, a man who mocked her tale was found drowned in shallow water, his skin pale as chalk, seaweed knotted around his fingers. Even now, when storms coil along the southern coast, lights move on the cliffs where no path remains. The tide rises higher there, pulled by something unseen. Some say she bargained for her husband's soul, others that she traded it for power. But when the thunder rolls across Greystone and the sea turns silver beneath the lightning, the people still close their shutters and whisper her name, because bargains made with grief are never kept, and the widow's lantern still burns for the dead. The church at Mornstead has no congregation now, only a hollow tower and 4 cracked bells that no hand dares touch. The villagers say the bells ring on their own, always before disaster, always in fog. Their sound is strange, too low, too slow, like something heavy striking underwater. When the mist comes down the valley, the bells begin, one after another, tolling for no living soul. The first time it happened was in 1731. The sexton, a man named Peter Cale, was found at the base of the bell tower, his neck broken. The ropes lay coiled beside him, untouched. Yet every bell had sounded through the night. The vicar himself heard them while walking home from the rectory. He swore he saw the ropes moving on their own, swinging in rhythm, the air thick with the smell of smoke. The next morning, half the village burned. The fire began in the baker's house, though no spark was ever found. After that, the bells rang before every tragedy. Plague, flood, war. Once, they sounded 3 days straight before the mines collapsed and buried 14 men alive. The priest declared it divine warning, though his sermons grew quieter with each toll. Finally, one summer, desperate to end the curse, he ordered the bells taken down. The men who climbed the tower swore they felt something pushing back, a pressure in the air that made their ears bleed. When they tried to lift the smallest bell, it screamed. The vicar fled that same night. They found his horse wandering by the river, his saddle soaked as if from rain, though the skies had been dry. The villagers sealed the church and let it rot, but the bells did not fall silent. They rang again that winter, their notes muffled beneath the snow. Those who listened said the sound didn't come from above anymore, it came from beneath the ground, as if the bells had buried themselves and still swung deep below the earth. In 1902, a team of restorers from London came to study the site. The villagers begged them to leave it alone. They laughed until the first night, when the bells began again. The men climbed the tower, finding the belfry empty, the ropes cut. Still, the air pulsed with vibration, shaking dust from the beams. They recorded the sound on wax cylinders. Only one survived, filled not with ringing, but with breathing slow, steady, like someone exhaling between every note. Today, the church stands alone, ivy choking its doors, the tower leaning into ruin. No one lives within earshot, yet travelers who camp nearby wake to faint vibrations rolling through the ground, a low rhythm like a heartbeat. The bells toll most often in winter, when the fog crawls low and the air tastes of metal. Some say they ring for warning. Others say they ring for want, for the hands that used to pull them, for the souls they buried, for the silence they refused to keep. And when they sound together, all 4 at once, the valley holds its breath, because that's the night the dead are said to answer. Back, he comes when the sky breaks open, when the fields shine like mirrors, and the roads drown beneath the weight of the storm. The villagers of Ashcombe call him the rider in the rain. They say he is neither man nor ghost, but a messenger caught between the two, condemned to ride until the clouds clear. His coming means someone nearby has been chosen, though no one knows whether for mercy or for death. The first record dates to 1624, when a constable returning from the county fair was found on the road outside Ashcombe, his horse standing still, its eyes rolling white. The man sat upright in the saddle, rain dripping from his hat brim, his face untouched by water. When they pulled him down, his clothes were dry as parchment, but his skin was cold as stone. The coroner wrote only 4 words in the ledger: "Found dead, still raining." That night, others saw a lone rider galloping through the downpour, his coat dark and glistening, his horse's hooves silent even in the mud. Through the centuries, he appeared again and again, always on storm nights, always alone. Farmers working the fields would glance up to see him at the edge of their land, a dark figure on a pale horse, unmoving beneath the lightning. Travelers met him on the road and felt the rain stop around them, as if the sky itself held its breath. One woman claimed he passed her wagon, and though she saw no face beneath his hood, she heard a whisper in her ear, "You've been heard." Her husband died 2 days later, drowned in his own well. In the late 1800s, a historian from Exeter visited the village to document the tale. He wrote that the rider must have been inspired by an old legend, a revenant knight who drowned in a flood after breaking a sacred vow. But the villagers told him of something older, a spirit that carried messages for the hunt, riding ahead to mark the next soul bound to join it. The historian scoffed, staying the night at the local inn. Before dawn, the innkeeper found him gone. His horse was discovered the next morning at the river's edge, rains trailing, saddle soaked. The historian's hat floated downstream for miles. Even now, when storms sweep across Devon, the villagers bar their doors and cover their mirrors. They say reflections invite him, that if the rider sees himself in glass or water, he will step through it, leaving behind only the sound of hooves fading into rain. Motorists on the moorland roads report headlights catching a figure ahead, a horseman motionless in the downpour, watching them pass. When they look back, he's gone, though the sound of hooves continues, pacing just beyond sight. Old people say he rides not in malice, but in duty. Someone must lead the hunt through the storm, and someone must bear the names of the soon to depart. When the rain thickens and the thunder rolls low across the valleys, they whisper, "Let him ride past," because if the rider stops at your gate and raises his head, you'll see your own reflection staring back, pale, wet, and waiting for the clouds to break. In the rolling fields between Dorset and Wiltshire lie the hollow hills, long, gentle mounds covered in grass, so even that cattle graze upon them without knowing what sleeps below. The locals say the hills are not earth at all, but chambers, vast rooms carved in another age, sealed by stone and silence. The old maps call them the sleeping barrows, though every generation learns anew why they should have been left untouched. The first awakening came in the spring of 1822, when miners digging for chalk struck something hard. Beneath the soil lay a slab of black limestone, smooth as glass, covered in carvings that no one could read. When they pried it open, a breath of air escaped, warm, foul, and strangely sweet, as though the hill itself exhaled. One man collapsed on the spot, his lungs seared as if by smoke. The others ran, but the sound followed them, a low moan rising from the hole, deep and rhythmic, like the beating of a great heart. They sealed the opening by nightfall, but the damage was done. Within days, the grass on the hill turned grey. Sheep grazing nearby grew thin and refused to eat. The miners' families heard noises under the floorboards, faint scratching, like stone moving against stone. When the foreman's wife fell ill, her fever dreams were filled with whispering voices that spoke in echoes, asking to be remembered. She died before the week's end, her mouth filled with fine dust. The hills were left alone for nearly a century after that, marked on maps as cursed ground. But in 1911, a team of archaeologists arrived. Armed with picks and lanterns, they found the same carvings, the same sealed chamber, and once again, they opened it. Inside, they found not bones, but rows of figures carved into the walls, tall, narrow shapes with elongated heads and hollow eyes. In the center of the chamber stood a stone table, and on it, the remains of something that might once have been human, though the proportions were wrong. The arms, too, long, the jaw unhinged, the fingers curved like hooks. The youngest of the team insisted the carvings shifted in the lantern light, their mouths opening wider the longer he stared. When the team returned the next morning, the hill had changed. The air above it shimmered like heat haze, though frost lay on the ground. The lead archaeologist was missing. His tent lay torn apart, the earth beneath it disturbed, soft as freshly dug soil. His footprints led up the hill and vanished halfway down the other side. Today, the hollow hills are fenced off, their entrances collapsed. Locals who live nearby still hear things when the wind is low, dull thuds, as if something beneath is moving, slow and patient. On certain nights, lights pulse under the grass, a faint green glow that fades with dawn. Farmers say it's foxfire, scholars say gas, but the old ones know better. They say the hills are breathing again, and when the earth breathes, it does so to remember what it once buried and what it still hungers to wake. At the edge of Thorn Hollow, where the land begins to dip toward the marshes, lies a meadow that blooms out of season. Every spring, when the rest of the countryside is still grey with frost, the field erupts into colour, thousands of foxgloves rising from the soil, their petals crimson instead of violet, their stems dark as iron. The villagers call it Bloodfield. It is beautiful from afar, terrible up close. No birds sing there, and the air smells faintly of copper. The field's story begins in 1648, when soldiers fleeing the Civil War camped on that very ground. They were deserters, weary and starving, hiding from their own regiment. The villagers brought them food and water, though quietly, fearing reprisal. But one night, a storm rolled in thunder, shaking the church spire, rain turning the soil to blood-red mud. By dawn, the soldiers were gone. Their campfires still smoked, their weapons lay scattered, but there was no trace of their bodies. Only the foxgloves remained, blooming overnight where the men had slept. A century later, farmers tried to plough the land, thinking the old tales nonsense. Every man who worked the field fell sick before harvest. They described dreams of red rain, of voices calling from beneath the soil. One ploughman's horse collapsed mid-step, its belly swelling, its veins turning the color of rust. When the doctor came, he found the soil strangely warm, as though something beneath it still lived. The crops that did grow were pale, tasteless, and withered before midsummer. By the Victorian age, Bloodfield was abandoned. Children dared each other to run through it, but few made it far. They said the flowers whispered soft, sibilant sounds, like breath drawn through teeth. Sometimes, in the space between one gust of wind and the next, you could hear names among them, the names of those who had vanished. On certain nights, faint lights moved between the stalks, not fireflies, but the dim glow of lanterns carried by unseen hands. In 1897, a botanist named Lydia Crane came to study the flowers. She found they thrived only in that one patch of land. Samples taken elsewhere refused to root, wilting within days. Yet the foxgloves of Bloodfield never died, even through frost and drought. She wrote that the petals bled when cut, staining her gloves pink. Her final journal entry reads, "It is not the field that is cursed, it is fed." She disappeared 2 weeks later. Only her satchel was found lying in the middle of the meadow, the leather soft and damp as if soaked from within. To this day, no one harvests from that soil. In early summer, when the flowers rise again, the villagers hang crosses in their windows and keep their doors shut after dusk. If you walk by at night, the field glows faintly, like embers under ash. And if you lean close enough to the blooms, you'll hear it a heartbeat, slow and deep, pulsing through the roots. The foxgloves of Bloodfield do not grow from seed. They grow from memory watered each year by the rain that never stops falling beneath the earth. There's a stretch of moorland in Northumberland where the fog never truly lifts. Even in summer, the mist clings low to the ground, veiling the heather and swallowing sound. The locals call it the Widow's Walk. Travelers who stray from the road after sunset sometimes glimpse a faint light weaving through the haze, a lantern, swinging slow and steady, carried by no visible hand. Those who follow it vanish. Those who run hear footsteps behind them, keeping perfect pace until dawn. The tale begins in 1786 with a woman named Margaret Linton, wife to a sea captain lost in a wreck off Whitby. She refused to accept his death. Every night, she carried her lantern across the moor, waiting for his spirit to find her. When storms swept the coast, she'd climb the ridge and call his name into the wind. The villagers pitied her until pity curdled into fear. Strange lights began to appear near her cottage, flickering in windows, reflected in puddles where no light should be. Then, one winter evening, she was gone, her door wide open, her lantern burning by the hearth. Searchers found her footprints leading straight into the marsh, ending at a patch of ground where the reeds grew thick and black. No body was ever recovered, but for years afterward, her lantern was seen moving across the moor, always on foggy nights, always toward the ridge that overlooked the sea. It burned with an orange light at first, then turned pale, like fire seen underwater. As decades passed, sightings grew stranger. Shepherds claimed the lantern called to them, swinging 3 times before pausing, as if beckoning them nearer. Those who ignored it said they dreamed of Margaret afterward, her eyes glowing like the lantern's flame. A constable sent to investigate disappeared in 1831. His notebook was found days later, pages warped with damp. His last entry read, "The light divides when approached, one toward the cliff, one behind." By the 20th century, the widow's lantern had become local legend. Couples dared each other to find it. Soldiers stationed nearby followed it across the moor, laughing until the fog thickened and the laughter died. In 1946, a pilot flying low over the valley reported a light keeping pace with his plane, matching his turns until it rose and vanished into cloud. The radar showed nothing. Today, the lantern still burns. Hikers mistake it for a farmhouse window or a headlamp until it moves against the wind. Those who've seen it up close say it's not made of glass or brass at all, but bone ribs curved around a flame that flickers blue at its heart. Some believe it's Margaret herself, bound to the light she once carried, still searching for her husband's soul. Others whisper that she found him long ago, that now she guides other lost spirits through the fog, collecting them as she goes. But the elders of the village keep a simpler warning. If you see the widow's lantern swaying in the mist, don't call out. Don't wave, don't follow. Just turn away and keep walking, for she lights the path only for the dead, and once she knows your face, she'll make sure you don't walk alone. Every child in the northern dales has heard the story, the one they whisper around bonfires when the wind moans through the heather. It begins as a dare. Stand on Harker's Hill after midnight, cup your hands to your mouth, and howl like a hound. If you're brave enough to do it, they say, something will answer. The hill itself is nothing remarkable, a rise of shale and bracken, marked by the half-buried stones of an Iron Age fort. Yet no animals live there. Birds turn in mid-flight, and sheep refuse to graze within its shadow. The old folk claim that long before the Romans, hunters called upon spirits to aid their chase, and one night they called something that never left. They say the wind that circles the hill isn't wind at all, but breath. The first written account came in 1814, when a shepherd named Eli Ray returned home pale as chalk, his hair wet though the night had been dry. He'd gone up the hill to look for a lost lamb. At the top he'd called out to his dog, whistled. Then, on a foolish whim, howled. The sound came back immediately, louder, deeper, and closer. He turned, thinking it was an echo, but the air was still, the grass unmoving. Then came the second howl, not from behind, but beside him. He ran until he reached his cottage, swearing he'd felt hot breath on his neck the whole way down. The next morning, the lamb was found dead at the hill's base, its throat unmarked, its eyes wide with terror. Through the decades, Others tried to test the tale. Two boys in 1892 climbed the hill with a horn to record the echo. The villagers found the horn days later, flattened into the mud, as though pressed down by enormous weight. In 1937, a university researcher set up recording equipment there. The tape captured a man's voice calling into the dark, followed by another voice answering. The problem was, the answer came before the call. By the 1960s, the government fenced the area off for geological instability. Locals knew better. They said the earth there was hollow, that something beneath the hills stirred whenever the living imitated its cry. Some nights, when fog covered the moors, people miles away claimed to hear it. A long, rising howl that made windows rattle and dogs hide under beds. Always, the sound ended the same way, a short, low exhalation, like laughter cut off mid-breath. Even now, hikers who wander too far from the path sometimes return shaken, unable to explain what chased them. They describe a sound that moves with them, circling unseen, echoing their own breath back at them in time. And if you stand on Harker's Hill when the wind is still and the stars are hidden, and you dare to call into the night, remember this: it will not echo you, it will answer. And when it does, it won't stop until you do. The story of Edmund Vane began like any other ghost tale, quietly, in candlelight, whispered among neighbors who wished it were not true. He was a landscape painter from London, who came to the Lake District in 1839 seeking inspiration. The newspapers called him gifted. His patrons called him troubled. He painted quickly, feverishly, as if racing against something unseen. The last letters he sent to his sister speak of shadows that do not belong to the clouds. Vane took a cottage near Ullswater, surrounded by moor and mist. The locals welcomed him until he began to paint the hills at dusk. He'd sit for hours facing the same slope, long after the light had faded, his brush moving though he could barely see. When he brought his canvases to town, the villagers refused to hang them. Every sky was wrong, heavy, bruised, swirling with faces that seemed to move when the candlelight flickered. In the distance of one, faint but certain, were riders, pale shapes galloping through the fog. He insisted they were real. He told the innkeeper that the hills themselves breathed after sunset, that he could hear their sighs in the stillness between brushstrokes. His housekeeper found him one night standing in the rain, staring at the slope across the valley. When she asked what he was looking at, he whispered, "They're watching the light die. They hate the dark, but they belong to it." After that, he stopped sleeping. One morning, a farmer passing by saw him painting on the ridge, his easel half buried in mud. He waved, but Vane didn't turn. The man walked closer and realized the painter wasn't moving at all. His eyes were open, fixed on the horizon. The canvas before him was blank except for a single long streak of grey, running from top to bottom, like a shadow. They buried him in the churchyard at Patterdale. The coroner wrote exposure and exhaustion. The villagers said otherwise. Weeks later, the local curate received a package from London, Vane's final crate of paintings. Inside were 6 canvases, all of the same view, the moor at dusk, the clouds low and red, but on each successive painting, the shapes in the distance crept closer, vague at first, then clearer. By the 6th, they had reached the foreground. They were not men or beasts, but something between long-limbed, featureless figures with the suggestion of hounds at their sides. When the curate turned the last canvas over, words were scrawled on the back in Vane's hand. "They stand behind the rain." The paintings were burned that same night, but the smoke carried a scent no one could name: wet earth, salt, and something like iron. The villagers say that when the mist gathers in the valley now, faces still form in the clouds above the water, and if you walk the ridge where Edmund Vane made his final sketch, you'll see streaks of grey across the grass, as though the rain itself tried to paint and failed to stop. At the farthest reach of the Cornish cliffs, where the sea gnaws endlessly at Black Rock, stand the remains of St. Olwen's Abbey. Most maps leave it unmarked. Now the road to it was lost a century ago, washed away by storms. but the fishermen still see it from their boats, a silhouette of arches rising out of the mist, its windows glowing faintly long after nightfall. They call it the abbey at the edge of the world, and they swear it prays for no man. The abbey's chronicles tell of monks who came there in the 12th century to build a refuge of silence. The storms were constant. The winds screamed through the cloisters like wounded things. Yet the brothers believed they were nearer to heaven than anywhere else on earth. They rang their bells each dusk, the sound swallowed by the roar of the sea. For years, all was well, until the winter the sea began to answer. It started with a single note, deep and mournful, rolling in from the horizon each night after the bells had stopped. Some thought it thunder, others said it was the voice of God. But when the tide receded, dead fish lay piled against the rocks, and their scales shimmered faintly with light. The abbot forbade further bell ringing, fearing it summoned something from below. The brothers obeyed for a time. Then one night, as lightning carved the sky, one young monk climbed the tower and rang the bell himself. He said later that the sound echoed back not once, but twice the second toll, lower, slower, as if another bell had answered from beneath the waves. By dawn, the lower cells were flooded. The monk was found kneeling in the chapel, his eyes glazed white, his hands clasped around a fragment of coral, shaped like a crucifix. The sea had risen without storm, and it did not retreat for 3 days. When it finally withdrew, the abbey's foundation stones were coated in a strange black film like soot that would not wash away. The abbot called for a fast of silence. Yet that night, the brothers heard chanting drifting through the corridors. Though none of them spoke, one by one, the monks disappeared. Their beds remained made, their bowls half filled, as if they'd stepped out mid-prayer. The abbot sealed the abbey doors and walked into the surf, carrying the coral cross. His footprints ended at the waterline. The sea turned still, and the chanting stopped. 200 years later, sailors passing the coast saw light spilling from the abbey's windows during a storm, gold, flickering, as if hundreds of candles burned within. But no one who ventured ashore afterward ever found a single living soul. The pews were dry, the candles cold, the air heavy with the scent of salt and iron. To this day, when tempests gather off the Cornish coast, the fishermen hear bells beneath the thunder, slow, deliberate, as if wrung from under the sea. Some say it's the monks still keeping their vigil. Others say the ocean finally claimed the abbey and made it part of its choir. And on the worst nights, when the horizon glows faintly gold, the sea itself seems to whisper in prayer, not for salvation, but for memory. On the north coast of Yorkshire, where the cliffs crumble into chalk and salt eats everything it touches, there is a beach that never truly dries. The tide retreats only halfway, leaving the sand white and shining like bone. Locals call it Saltmere Strand. No footprints last there, and no birds ever land. But on certain nights, when the wind turns east and the sea glows faintly with moonlight, a low hum rises from beneath the sand, as though something buried deep below were trying to remember its own sound. The fishermen say that hum belongs to the Horn of Saltmere, an artifact dug up centuries ago and wisely returned to the sea. Its story begins in 1711, when a storm split the cliffs and revealed a hollow chamber inside a space lined with stone, slick with brine, the air inside thick and sweet like rot. Within it lay a single object, a great curved horn carved from pale bone, etched with runes no one could read. The men who found it said it sang even when they didn't touch it, vibrating like a living thing. The horn was brought to the village church, where the vicar, a learned man, called it a relic of the old pagans. He tried to silence it with prayer, but the air around it trembled, making the candles gutter. That night, the vicar dreamed of a vast figure walking through water, its shadow stretching to the horizon. When he awoke, the church door stood open, and the horn was gone. The fisherman who'd discovered it was found dead at the tide's edge, his mouth packed with salt. Years later, a traveling antiquarian uncovered a letter written by the vicar himself. It spoke of guilt of returning the horn to the beach, burying it where the waves met the land, covering it with stones, so that its call may never find an ear again. He ended with a warning. If the wind ever changes and the horn is heard once more, run inland and do not stop. But the sea is never kind to secrets. In 1890, another storm came, carving the beach open once more. The next morning, villagers awoke to find the tide far lower than ever before, as if drawn out by breath. Then came the sound, a note so deep it rattled windows, rolling for miles through the valleys. Sheep broke from their pens, dogs hid under beds, and the air itself seemed to pulse. The sound lasted 3 nights, then stopped abruptly. In the morning, the beach was gone, the cliffs collapsed, the shore swallowed by the sea. Today, Saltmere Strand exists only at low tide. Divers who explore the shallows speak of hearing faint music rising through the silt, a vibration felt more than heard, rhythmic as a heartbeat. Some claim to see shapes moving beneath the surface, as if the sand itself were breathing. The old families of the coast still scatter handfuls of salt across their thresholds during storms, whispering the same warning the vicar wrote 3 centuries ago. If you hear the horn, it's already too late. For the horn of Saltmere was not made to summon men, it was made to wake whatever sleeps beneath them. In the forests of Northumbria, where the pines grow tall and black against the sky, there are nights when the wind carries a sound that is neither beast nor man. It begins as a single cry, long, low, and mournful, and then grows, layering into harmony, as if a dozen throats sing the same note in perfect sorrow. The people of the border villages call it the choir of wolves, though those who've heard it up close say it isn't wolves at all, it's voices. The legend dates back to the reign of Henry VIII, when a monastery stood on the edge of the forest. The monks there kept hounds to hunt the wolves that stalked their sheep. One bitter January, their abbot forbade them from lighting fires. He believed the smoke offended heaven. When the frost came, the brothers froze in their cells, their prayers muffled by ice. The hounds howled all through the night, their cries echoing off the stone walls, until one of the brothers, delirious with cold, went mad and opened the gate. By morning, every pen was empty. The dogs had fled into the forest. So had the monks. Only the abbot remained, kneeling before the altar, his hands clasped tight around a candle that would not burn. They found no footprints leading away from the monastery, only claw marks gouged into the stone threshold. When night fell, the villagers waiting beyond the trees heard howling again. Only this time, the sound was human, rising in perfect pitch, swelling and falling like the plain song they once sang in chapel. Since then, the choir returns whenever the winter is cruel. The notes move through the forest in waves, circling as if the singers travel together. No living wolf remains in that part of England, yet the howls continue, precise, rhythmic, mournful. Hunters who followed the sound say the air changes the moment they cross the tree line. The snow hushes, the wind stops, and the sound surrounds them, not distant but everywhere, filling their chest as though the forest itself is singing through them. In 1895, a scholar from Durham brought recording equipment to capture the phenomenon. The wax cylinder he made still exists, faint, warbling, distorted by age. It begins with wind and the crackle of snow underfoot, then a deep tone like a bell. The sound rises slowly into harmony. But partway through, the scholar speaks, "Good God, they're behind me," and the recording ends with a strangled gasp and a soft chorus that fades into silence. His body was found weeks later in the thaw, face turned upward, his mouth open in a silent howl. The forest still stands, though no one dares enter after dark. Locals bar their doors when frost touches the trees, and travelers passing through keep their windows shut tight. Because if you listen too long, the song doesn't just echo, it settles in your lungs, reshaping your breath into its rhythm. They say the choir of wolves isn't a haunting at all. It's a prayer, a cold hymn sung by those who lost their way between salvation and hunger. And every winter, when the first snow falls, the forest opens its throat and sings again. waiting for new voices to join its endless harmony. In the old town of Whitfell, the church clock has no hands. They were taken down more than 2 centuries ago, after too many people saw the same reflection staring back from its glass. The parish records call him the Harbinger, a figure who appears when calamity is near, his eyes shining from any surface that dares to catch the light. Not quite human, not quite ghost, he was first seen in the spring of 1709, the year the frost never ended. The earliest account comes from the diary of Martha Kellen, a weaver's wife. She wrote of rising one morning to find the frost creeping up the inside of her window, forming the shape of 2 perfect circles, side by side, like eyes. When she wiped them away, they reappeared, pressed against the glass from the outside. That night, her husband died in his sleep, no wound, no illness, only the faint scent of iron in the room. By dawn, the same frost eyes had spread to every window on their street. Within a week, half the village was dead of cold. After that winter, the townspeople learned to fear the reflection of eyes where no face should be. Mirrors were covered, wells sealed with boards, and buckets left overturned so that water could not hold a gaze. Yet still, the sightings came in puddles, in polished wood, even in the glint of pewter spoons. The Harbinger was always the same, a suggestion of a face without features, the eyes too bright, the light around them bending wrong. Children who stared too long grew feverish, their pupils turned white. When the great storm of 1763 struck Whitfell, the Harbinger returned. The wind howled so fiercely that the church bell rang without hands to pull it. In the lightning's glare, villagers saw him standing beneath the steeple, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. The rain fell sideways, and yet his cloak never moved. By morning, the river had burst its banks, carrying away 40 homes and the rectory. The church's clock face cracked down the middle, and behind, the shattered glass, 2 faint circles of light still glowed. In the 19th century, a railway engineer working near Whitfell recorded his own encounter. He wrote that he'd seen a pair of eyes gleaming from the puddle beneath my boot, and when he looked closer, the reflection blinked. That night, the bridge he was building collapsed before completion, killing every man on his crew but him. He resigned the next day and never returned. Modern visitors sometimes find Whitfell picturesque, its empty cottages, its ruined church, but they notice how the locals carry no mirrors, no polished silver, nothing that might return a reflection. They still tell newcomers the rule passed down for generations. If you see eyes shining where none should be, do not blink, do not turn away, because once you've seen the Harbinger, he has seen you too. And his gaze is not a warning, it's a promise, waiting for the hour when the frost will find you next. On the outskirts of Lincolnshire, near a ruined Roman road that ends in a hollow field, stands a pair of leaning stones, blackened by age and lichen. The villagers call them the Gate. No one knows what it once opened onto. There is no fence, no wall, only open ground and wind. But when the fog rolls low and the air grows still, travelers speak of hearing chains dragging between the stones, and of a dog that watches from the dark. The first story comes from 1695, when a merchant named Bartholomew Reed stopped there to rest his horse. He later wrote that his lantern dimmed, though no wind stirred. From the shadows stepped a massive black hound, silent but for the faint clink of metal from its neck. Its eyes glowed a color he could not name, not gold, not red, but something that moved between both, like flame seen through smoke. The dog did not growl. It simply stood between the stones, barring his way. Reed, trembling, threw it a piece of bread. The hound sniffed it, turned its head toward the earth, and vanished. That night, the merchant's home caught fire. He and his family escaped, but his stables burned to ash. He told no one until years later, when he confessed that the hound had lifted its head once as if warning him to leave. By the 19th century, the gate was known as cursed ground. No crops grew near it. Horses shied away, and dogs refused to cross its shadow. Yet the hound was seen again and again, always alone, always still, its chain glimmering faintly as though wet. One poacher claimed to have struck it with a shovel, but his blade passed through the creature like smoke, and his arm withered black within a week. Before he died, he muttered, "It guards what should not open." When the railway surveyors came in 1882, they marked the site for excavation, but on the first night of digging, the men were awakened by the sound of barking not near, but beneath them, deep under the ground. The foreman's journal describes the noise as rhythmic, measured, as though something below were pacing the earth itself. They abandoned the project by morning. 2 months later, the foreman was found dead in his bed, his boots filled with wet clay. Even now, travelers who pass the field after dark speak of the same sight. A tall shape between the stones, the faint glint of a chain, and eyes watching without malice or mercy. Locals say the hound is not a spirit of death, but of restraint, that it was bound to guard a doorway no man should open. On moonless nights, the ground between the stones seems to pulse, faintly blue, as if breathing. Those who've lingered there claim the air bends inward, pulling at their hearts. If you turn your back too quickly, you might hear the rattle of the chain behind you, taut for a single breath, as though the hound has taken one step closer, testing whether you'll cross. They say if it ever leaves the gate, the thing it guards will follow. She is the only mortal name whispered alongside the wild hunt Alice of Redmere, the woman who rode with the dead and returned. The chroniclers of Ely call her a heretic. The ballads call her a bride of storm and shadow. But in the villages scattered through the fens, they remember her differently. Not as damned, but as chosen, the one who heard the hunt's horn and did not run. The story begins in 1326, in the flooded lands near Redmere Abbey. Alice was a falconer's daughter, born to silence and wind. She grew up walking the reed banks alone, her eyes turned skyward while others hid from the storm. When thunder rolled, she would laugh and lift her arms, claiming she could feel the horses galloping in the clouds. The villagers whispered that she had the fen blood, the uncanny patience of those who listened too closely to things the world had forgotten. One winter night, while leading her father's hawk home, she saw lights dancing above the marsh, torches moving where no path ran. Then came the sound of hooves, soft at first, then rising into a roar. She stood still as the reeds bent, and a host of riders swept across the water, hounds baying in their wake. Their cloaks streamed behind them like banners of smoke. At their front rode a figure in a helm of silver antlers, his eyes burning faintly blue. He saw her, reined his horse, and lifted his horn. The villagers found her hours later, lying in the reeds. She was breathing, but her eyes glowed with fever, her lips whispering a name none could understand. For 7 nights she slept, her skin cold as frost, her hair streaked with white. When she awoke, she spoke little. She kept her hawk close, though its eyes had turned the same pale color as her own. That spring, when the hunt returned, Alice was waiting. Witnesses claimed she mounted a horse of her own, a white mare no one had seen before, and rode out to meet the storm. The riders parted for her, the hounds circling without harm. Some said she rode at their side into the sky. Others swore they saw her leading them, her lantern raised high, the antlered lord behind her. By dawn, the marsh was empty, the sky clear. Years later, a fisherman found her body on the bank of the Ouse unmarked, her face serene. Her hands were folded over a horn made of bone and ash, too cold to touch. When he turned it over, water poured from its mouth, though the river had been dry for weeks. They buried her beneath the alder trees, but her grave never stayed still. Each storm shifted the earth as though something beneath still moved, restless. Even now, when the wind screams across the fens and the torches of the hunt flare in the clouds, people swear they see her pale hair streaming, eyes like lightning, her hawk circling overhead. She rides at the hunt's flank, neither ghost nor saint, carrying a lantern that never dims. Some say she guides lost souls home. Others say she's searching still for the man with the antlered helm, or for the world that once let her belong. The story of Hollowmere begins, like most tragedies, with snow. It fell for 7 days straight, burying hedgerows, smothering fields, turning the whole valley into a white silence. On the 8th morning, a passing post rider reached the outskirts and saw smoke curling from the chimneys, neat and grey. But when he entered the village square, he found no one there. The doors stood open, the fires still burned, and not a single footprint marked the snow. That was in the winter of 1799. The village had been thriving. 50 families, a church, an inn, a blacksmith, and a school. Yet every soul vanished between one sunset and the next. Livestock stood shivering in their pens, unfed but unharmed. Dinner plates were set on tables, chairs pulled out, candles still guttering. It was as if the people had risen from their meals and simply walked into the air. The only mark of motion was a pattern in the center of the green, an enormous circle of melted snow, perfectly smooth. The grass beneath blackened like coal. The magistrate's men arrived within 2 days. They combed the forest, dragged the river, even opened the church crypt. Nothing. But one constable recorded something peculiar. The snow within the village never stayed still. At night it shifted, subtly, as though stirred from beneath. He wrote that when he stood very still, he could hear a faint, rhythmic sound, breathing, slow and deep, coming from the earth itself. A week later, the search party vanished. Their horses were found on the main road. Reins snapped, eyes wide and glassy. The magistrate sealed the case, declaring it an act of divine frost. But those who lived nearby told different tales. They said the villagers had been taken not by men or weather, but by something beneath the ground. For centuries they'd drawn water from an ancient spring under the chapel, said to run warm even in winter. In the old days, before the church was built, that spring was sacred to a goddess of the repair-it, underworld. The people had stopped offering her tribute long ago. Perhaps she had come to collect her due. In 1923, an archaeologist reopened the site. The church had collapsed by then, and the well lay hidden under ivy. When they cleared the stones, they found the water still warm, still clear. They lowered a light down and saw the reflection of faces, hundreds of them pale and blurred as if pressed against glass. The professor dropped his lantern and fled. When his team returned, the well had sealed itself with a thin crust of ice, smooth as a mirror. Today, Hollowmere exists only as a name on old maps. The land is empty now, no roads, no ruins, only a gentle hollow in the hills. But travelers who pass through in winter sometimes report footprints appearing beside their own, small at first, then more, matching their pace, encircling them until the air grows warm and the snow begins to sink. When they look back, the prints are gone. And if they listen closely, just before the wind shifts, they can still hear that faint sound beneath their feet, the slow, steady breath of a village that never stopped sleeping. At the edge of Caldermore stands an oak unlike any other. Its trunk is wide and gnarled, twisted by centuries of wind, its bark blackened and fissured like scorched stone. Locals call it the Bleeding Oak, though no one remembers why it earns that name. They only know what happens when winter winds tear across the moor. A red sap seeps from the fissures, thick and dark as clotted blood, and the air carries a coppery scent that makes men shiver. The story begins in 1487, when the oak was young but already massive. A band of mercenaries, fleeing a skirmish with a rival lord, hid beneath its branches during a storm. One of them, a man named Gerard, struck the tree in frustration, stabbing at its trunk with his sword. The moment the blade touched bark, it quivered. A single drop of crimson ran down from the wound. Gerard laughed, thinking it sap, but when he bent closer, the drop hissed against his cheek, hot as fire. That night, he was found dead, eyes wide, face pale, lips drawn back, in silent horror. For centuries, travelers avoided the oak. Those who dared to sleep beneath it reported dreams of battlefields long forgotten. of men and horses charging through mist, their cries swallowed by the wind. Shepherds who passed the tree during winter sometimes woke to find their sheep circling the trunk in panic, their eyes reflecting shapes in the bark, faces twisted in anguish, mouths open as if calling for aid. During the English Civil War, soldiers camped nearby swore that the tree bled every time a battle was fought in the valley below. The sap would seep thicker, running in rivulets down the roots, staining the snow or grass in vivid streaks of red. Officers claimed it was a bad omen. Foot soldiers said the tree's bark whispered in the night, counting names. When a company marched past the oak, 3 men disappeared, never to be seen again. Their footprints ended at the roots, melting into the blood-red sap. By the Victorian age, folklore had transformed into superstition. Botanists came to study the tree, calling it a species anomaly. They tried to scrape its bark, measure the sap, and even ignite it to see if it would boil like resin. Nothing worked. The sap bled freely, even in frost, its heat unwavering. Candles placed at the base were extinguished as if the air itself drew them out. One scholar fainted after smelling the sap. He later claimed he saw the tree's branches reach toward him, bending low, forming shapes like skeletal hands. Even today, the oak remains, gnarled and enormous, rising from the edge of colder moor. On cold nights, the sap still drips bright red, running slow as if time itself flows through it. Hikers report the coppery scent, thick and metallic, and the sense of being watched, as if the tree counts every heartbeat. Some say the bleeding oak remembers every wound inflicted upon it, every name struck from its shade, and if you linger too long beneath its branches, you may hear whispers that are not wind, voices of men and horses that once passed through the moor, echoing forever through the oak that still bleeds. On the cliffs of East Wensley, where the sea strikes the rock with relentless fury, there lies a cavern the locals call Stormouth. Its mouth is wide and black, and when the tide surges, waves vanish into it like swallowed shadows. Within that hollow, a horn rests, or perhaps it rests nowhere at all. For centuries, travelers, fishermen, and lighthouse keepers have heard its call, long after the instrument itself was buried in salt and stone. They call it the horn that would not cease. The first mention comes from a sailor's log in 1643. He wrote of a voyage past the cliffs, fog pressing against the hull, when a note sounded low, long, and vibrating through the timbers. He and his crew searched the deck and the rigging, but the sound came from below, as though rising from the sea itself. The note lasted until morning, and when it ended, one man was gone. No footprints, no struggle, nothing but a faint echo, like the memory of a scream. The horn was said to be made in the pagan age, carved from the bone of a giant whale and etched with runes for summoning. It was blown only when the hunt moved the spectral riders riding across the skies, their hounds baying to the rhythm of its call. During the medieval period, chroniclers recorded that any time the horn sounded, the villagers nearby suffered, livestock disappeared, crops blackened overnight, and the sick died suddenly in their beds. In 1728, a group of monks attempted to seal the horn beneath a stone altar in Stormouth Cavern. They prayed and sprinkled holy water, marking the spot with iron crosses. For a time, the sea seemed calm, the wind still. Then, during a summer storm, the horn blew again, not once, but continuously through 3 nights and 4 days. Ships that sailed past reported hearing it, even if the cavern was miles inland at low tide. Mariners swore the waves themselves formed shapes, hounds and riders riding in the foam. By the 19th century, lighthouse keepers along the coast began recording it systematically. The notes came irregularly, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at midnight, always loud enough to rattle windows and shutters. When they tried to capture it on wax cylinders, the recording devices failed, shorting out instantly. One keeper, desperate, tied a bell to a line and dropped it into the cavern. The bell rang without moving, a sound stretched and warped by the horn beneath. When he returned, the bell had vanished, replaced by a faint imprint in the sand of a hound's paw. Even now, the sound persists. Fishermen speak of a note that rises with the tide, echoes off the cliffs, and fades only at dawn. It is said that anyone who hears the horn too clearly is marked. Their heart quickens unnaturally, their dreams filled with running hounds, the riders riding endlessly. The horn does not call to men, the villagers say. It calls the hunt itself, and when the wind shifts, it will not cease until it has taken all that it seeks, leaving only silence and salt in its wake. In the valley of Blackfen, where mist rolls like water and the hills cut the sky in jagged shadows, the villagers tell of a morning that never arrived. It happened in the winter of 1621, and those who survived say the sun simply refused to rise. The horizon glowed faintly, pale as frost, but the light did not spread. For hours, the world lay in a grey, unmoving silence, as if time itself had stalled. The first to notice were the farmers tending their livestock, sheep huddled into tight knots, eyes wide, breathing steaming in the cold air. The dogs barked at nothing, ears pricked, tails stiff. When the men climbed the hills to see the horizon, they could not tell where the earth ended and sky began. Then came the sound, low, continuous, rising from the moors, the baying of hounds. The villagers had long feared the hunt, the riders who stalked the edges of memory and mist. But no one had imagined a morning without dawn. The hounds came first, their eyes glowing faintly in the grey, paws making no sound on the frost-hardened earth. Riders followed, silhouettes of shadow and smoke, cloaks streaming behind them, horns glowing like coals. The villagers fled into their homes, bolting doors and shuttering windows, but the sound did not abate. The hunt circled, as if counting, marking, claiming. By midday, the frost had turned black underfoot, and the villagers could hear voices whispering through the mist, not their own, but the voices of those long dead. Children and animals huddled together, trembling. One boy dared to peek from the loft window and saw a rider bend down toward his house, lantern flickering. When he looked away, the rider was gone, but the lantern remained in the field, glowing faintly, unmoving, as though waiting. The next night, the villagers lit candles in every window. They prayed, shouted, and sang psalms to drive the hunt away. Nothing worked. The hounds bayed, the riders circled, and the grey light persisted, refusing the passage of sun and moon. Those who fell asleep did so with the sound in their ears, waking to find their homes untouched, but their minds filled with the echo of horns and paws. By the third morning, the light shifted slightly, faint and cold, as if the horizon were exhaling. Some dared to step outside and found prints in the frost, not human, not beast, but large, precise, and looping back upon themselves. No one followed them. Those who tried reported hearing a low voice that mimicked their own, whispering a warning in a tongue older than the village. It was not until the fourth day that the sun finally rose. But the people of Blackfen never forgot that grey dawn. They say the land itself had opened a door, allowing the hunt to pass through in full. Every winter afterward, when fog rolls low and the wind lies still, they shutter their homes at first light. Because some mornings, if the sky holds its breath long enough, the dawn still refuses to come, and the hunt rides again. When the last rider passed through, the valley fell into a silence heavier than any night. Blackfen, Blackmere, and the hills beyond the moors that had trembled under the weight of hoofbeats and baying hounds lay still, as if holding its breath. The villagers dared not speak. Windows were left open, fires unlit, doors unlocked, for no sound could match what had passed, and the absence that followed seemed alive. It was said that the hunt did not leave behind bodies, nor blood, nor broken trees. Only the echoes remained, the memory of motion, the memory of sound. For hours, the frost-covered grass continued to vibrate faintly, as if the earth itself were replaying the rhythm of hoofbeats. No man could walk through the hollow without feeling it. The weight of invisible legs, the brushing of unseen cloaks against his shoulders. Farmers found their fields turned, the soil still warm as though something had slept beneath it. Children woke screaming in the night, dreaming of the pale riders circling their beds, hounds nipping at invisible heels. The elders spoke in whispers that stretched into days. They claimed the hunt had taken only those it intended, sparing the rest, yet leaving a warning pressed into the very air. The world is not safe, and nothing truly ends. The animals felt it too. Dogs howled without cause, horses balked at open meadows, sheep huddled together as if sensing the passing of something immense. Even the wind seemed subdued, bending low over the moors, hesitant to move for fear of disturbing the silence. Over time, the villagers rebuilt their lives, but the memory lingered. They avoided the ridges where the hounds had run fastest, the hollows where the riders had paused. Any who wandered too far were said to vanish, claimed by the echo of the hunt itself, leaving behind footprints pressed into frost that melted before morning. Travelers spoke of sudden chills, of a presence at their backs that left no shadow, no form, only a pressure against the air, and a quiet that screamed louder than any sound. By the 18th century, the story was part of the land itself. The hills, the moors, and the marshes remembered. Those who knew the tale whispered it to their children, not to frighten, but to teach caution. They spoke of the rhythm of hoofbeats, the flash of horns, the gleam of pale eyes in the fog, and how, after all of it, the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the hunt waiting. Even now, centuries later, the valleys carry a memory. On nights when the fog curls low and the wind holds its tongue, the air hums faintly with a pulse that cannot be explained. Travelers pause, the cattle freeze, the dogs tremble, and if one listens long enough, far off, there is a faint exhalation in the earth, a last sigh from the hunt, fading slowly into the silence it leaves behind. The people of these lands know the truth. The hunt is eternal. It rides again and again, through time and memory, leaving nothing visible, nothing tangible, only the quiet after it passes. And that quiet, heavier than any storm, carries its own warning that the world will never be safe, and the echo of the hounds will always return.